Does the human soul exist? Many have pondered this over centuries, believed by religious scholars and often rejected by scientists. But since the soul is supposed to leave the body after death, could you somehow prove that there is one? This is the question Duncan MacDougall asked himself in 1901. MacDougall was a 35-year-old physician from Massachusetts that wanted to prove the existence of the soul. He believed that the soul must have some mass and therefore it must be possible to measure it by weight. How will one go about to measure the soul? We don't even know where in the body it is, you might ask. Well, Mr. Duncan MacDougall was one step ahead of us. He got the idea to weigh the body of a dying person to see the weight before, during and after death. Quite morbid and a bit unethical if you ask me, and that's most likely why no one has had this idea before or after Duncan. I'm serious, no one has ever repeated the 21 grams experiment, ever. Nonetheless, there's still an issue at hand. Where do you get a dying person? And you'd assume Duncan needs several dying people to run these tests? Well, Mr. Duncan of course had a plan. He figured that he'd take terminally ill people, since it'd be easier to determine how soon they would die. Again, very morbid. But that wasn't all. Duncan wanted patients that had conditions which caused exhaustion because, well, it's not easy to weigh someone that's flopping around like a fish. I assume? Somehow, he managed to get his hands on 6 patients. With this man, you could assume he kidnapped a bunch of children at night, but don't worry. Miraculously, all patients volunteered. Thankfully for Duncan MacDougall, there was no shortage of sick people this time. There was an epidemic running rampant. It was the cause of 25% of all deaths, tuberculosis, or TB as many call it. 4 of the patients were suffering from tuberculosis, 1 from diabetes, and 1 was unclear what type of sick they were, but they were dying. That's all Duncan needed. When it was apparent that the Grim Reaper visited these poor patients, Duncan placed their beds on what I assumed to be a massive scale that could read within 0.2 of an ounce or 5.6 grams. What followed is just like my upload schedule, a complete mess. One of the patients actually lost weight after death, but quickly put it back on, which would imply that the soul came back? But the patient was dead, so no, something surely must be wrong about this patient's body, right? Well, 2 of the patients lost weight after death, but shortly lost even more weight, which makes even less sense.
I'm extremely confused. You're confused, I'm f***ing confused, bro.
Another patient died as they were placed in the bed, so that didn't count. The 5th patient died as Duncan was calibrating the scale, so he disregarded that one as well. But the last patient actually lost 3/4 of an ounce, or 21.3 grams. Hence why this experiment caught on as the 21 grams experiment. With inconclusive results, Duncan MacDougall couldn't publish his report as the experiment would have to be repeated many times before he could make a conclusion. He still believed in his idea of the soul and went on to do the same experiment on 15 poor dogs. In Duncan's report, he stated that the ideal test on dogs would be to obtain in those dying from disease that rendered them much exhausted and incapable for struggle. It was not my fortune to get dogs dying from such sickness. The test on the dogs were vitiated by the use of 2 drugs administered to secure the necessary quiet and freedom from struggle, necessary to keep the beam at balance. Which translates to that Duncan wanted to use sick dogs, but he was unable to find any, and that he poisoned 15 healthy dogs for this experiment. However, the dogs did not show any loss of weight after death, which Duncan was pleased by, as he didn't believe dogs had souls and therefore wouldn't lose any weight. So his result supported his hypothesis. MacDougall was unable to publish his report in the medical journal because in 1907 the New York Times got a hold of the story and leaked it in an article called "Soul Has Weight, Physician Thinks." His results were published in the medical journal American Medicine quickly after. After the publication of the experiment, MacDougall received heavy criticism, most notably by an Augustus Clark. Clark criticized the accuracy of said experiments. I can't understand why, because a mad scientist put 6 dying people on a scale and waited for them to die? It's like the opposite of a controlled environment. As well as that, he disregarded 2 of the patients, meaning that he had like 4 patients with different results, and he poisoned and killed 15 poor dogs. Why did he publish this at all? Anyhow, Clark concluded that the difference in results between humans and dogs were not because of dogs not having souls. It was because of body heat, and yes, you heard it, sweat. When a person dies, their body temperature rises suddenly since the lungs are not capable of cooling the blood anymore, which causes the body to profusely sweat, which then evaporates into the air. Dogs, as we all know, doesn't have sweat glands. That's why they hyperventilate to cool themselves down. Therefore, according to Clark, dogs don't lose sweat in the same manner as humans after death. The sweat could easily account for those 21 grams. Duncan and Clark continued to have heated debates by publishing various arguments in the medical journal for several months against each other. Duncan's experiment has been widely rejected by the scientific community, and he has been accused of fraud because of how he came about with his results, since only one of the 6 patients actually supported his theory. It was concluded that the experiment was the cause of selective reporting. Selective reporting is basically when you ignore the results you don't want because they don't support your theory and only use the ones that support it. What? Did you hear that? Did someone say flat earthers? And moving on, and not only that, but Duncan was criticized for having such a small sample size, that being 6 people, as well as how accurately he was able to determine the exact time of death, because, this was 1901 to 1907, probably wasn't the best medical equipment at the time. Duncan MacDougall died in 1920 without proving his theory or repeating his experiment. Today, the 21 grams experiment is known as a failed experiment, but Duncan did popularize the idea of the soul having a weight. The experiment also spawned a lot of pop culture references. There was a movie made in 2003 called The 21 Grams, which referenced the experiment. It was mentioned in an issue of the manga Gantz, a podcast called Welcome to Night Vale, the movie The Empire of Corpses, songs referencing it by Nike Heaton, Fedez, Fundamentals, and Travis Scott's song No Bystanders, among many others, as well as the documentary Beyond and Back. So the experiment still lives on as a reference, and while some still believe that the soul weighs 21 grams, Duncan MacDougall's experiment failed to prove it. And that was the story of the 21 grams experiment.